I stood in the biting cold of Dry Creek, Montana, in the winter of 1885, my breath fogging in the faint dawn light that barely crept through the cracks of our crumbling ranch. The wind howled across the barren plains, a cruel reminder of how unforgiving this land could be. I'm Ethan Vance, a 40-year-old cattleman, my hands calloused and my eyes heavy with years of grief. That stormy evening, fate brought a dying stranger to my door, a woman in tattered, embroidered brocade, her frail body trembling as she whispered, "It's too late now." We had barely enough food for me and my boys, Caleb and Jesse, but I couldn't turn her away. I carried her inside, cleaned her wounds with what little herbs I had, and shared our last scraps of supper. I had no idea this act of mercy would change not just her life, but the fate of my whole family. What secret did this woman carry that would upend everything for a broken man like me? Hey, if you're loving cowboy love stories or Western tales, drop a 1 in the comments for more Wild West love content. I knelt before our old family Bible, my rough fingers tracing the faded entries: births, our marriage, and now, my throat tightening, Mary's death certificate, the ink still sharp from 4 years ago. The leather cover was cracked, worn like everything else on this struggling ranch. I tucked it back into the cedar chest Mary loved, the one she'd brought into our marriage. Through the cabin's only window, I watched Caleb, 8, and Jesse, 6, playing in the yard. Their laughter cut me deep, a reminder of how fast their innocence was fading under hardship's weight. Caleb's already taking on chores too big for his years, while Jesse tries so hard to be the man of the house. The morning wind whistled through gaps in the cabin walls, gaps Mary would have nagged me to seal if that brutal attack hadn't taken her. I pulled my coat tighter, her voice echoing in my mind, promising to teach Caleb to mend fences come spring. Now winter's back, and I'm drowning in troubles I can't face alone. Our herd's down to a few scrawny steers and a sickly calf. The barn roof sagging, ready to cave under the next snow. The wheat field, once our pride, sits half-tended. I just don't have the strength to work it alone. I sold Mary's jewelry, my best horse, even my pa's old rifle, but the money's gone, barely covering our needs. Yesterday, Mr. Jenkins from the bank stopped by, his pity thin as his smile. 3 months, Mr. Vance, he said, shuffling papers like it was nothing. The bank's been patient, but we can't extend the mortgage further. I heated water for breakfast, stretching our last oats with dried prairie roots. Caleb came in, clutching a small bundle of kindling. "Only a little today, Pa," he said, his face too serious for a boy. "But it's dry." "Good work, son," I said, forcing a smile though my heart ached. "A few sticks wouldn't keep us warm tonight. Go get Jesse, breakfast near ready." As Caleb ran off, I split the porridge into 3 bowls, giving the boys more than me. Hunger's a familiar ache. Now a father's sacrifice feels as natural as breathing. Jesse burst in, waving a single egg from our last hen. "Look, Pa, found it under the coop." His eyes shone like Mary's used to, pride and sorrow twisting in my chest. "Well done, my brave boy," I said, ruffling his hair, noticing his coat sleeves creeping up his wrists. "They'll need new clothes before the next freeze, but that's a worry for later." Over breakfast, Caleb spoke up, stirring his porridge. "Mr. Thompson at the store said he'd pay me to sweep his porch after school. I could do it after chores." My throat tightened. My boys shouldn't have to work so young, but pride doesn't fill bellies. "That's kind of him, Caleb. Just don't skip your studies." Mary always insisted they learn to read and cipher, and I won't let that go. After breakfast, I watched them head to the schoolhouse a mile off, their patched clothes and worn boots screaming our poverty. But they walked tall, like I taught them Vance men don't slouch, no matter how low we're brought. Alone in the quiet cabin, I let myself break for a moment. My hands gripped the rough table as I whispered, "Mary, how do I do this without you?" The words hung unanswered, like every day since she was taken. But I've got no choice. 3 months to save our home. 3 months to pull off a miracle. I wiped my eyes, straightened my coat, and stepped out to face another day of back-breaking work and impossible choices. My boys need me strong, and I'll be that, even if it tears me apart. The storm hit just before dusk, the wind rattling the cabin shutters. I'd just finished checking our 3 steers and that frail calf when Jesse's voice cut through the gale. "Pa! Pa! Come quick!" There was a fear in his tone I'd never heard. I grabbed my hat, the wind whipping my coat as I followed his voice to the edge of the wheat field. Caleb was there, frozen, staring into the shadows. "Good Lord," I muttered, my hand dropping to the knife at my belt. A woman lay crumpled in the frozen mud, her fine brocade dress torn and filthy. A silver ring and a turquoise necklace glinted faintly beside her. Her clothes screamed, wealth embroidery too delicate for these parts, but wealth didn't matter when life was slipping away. "She's still breathing, Pa," Caleb whispered, his face pale. "We can't leave her. He was right. We had barely enough for ourselves, food, firewood, anything, but I couldn't let her die." "Jesse, stoke the fire. Caleb, help me." I knelt in the mud, feeling her pulse weak, like a bird's wing against my fingers. She groaned as we lifted her, her body light but heavy with exhaustion. Her face, even worn by pain, had a beauty that didn't belong here, her dark hair matted with dust. We got her inside, my back screaming from the effort. Jesse had the fire roaring, his eyes wide at the stranger in our home. "Caleb, get my herb box. Jesse, bring rags and water." My voice stayed steady, though my hand shook as I cut away her ruined dress. No bullet wounds, just bruises and cuts from what looked like a desperate escape. She'd been running maybe from someone worse than this storm. I'd seen worse in my years out here, but something about her stirred memories of Mary, of the night I couldn't save her. I cleaned her wounds with the last of my herbs, my eyes catching the ring and necklace on the table. They were finely made, not a wanderer's trinkets. The ring had intricate engravings, no name. The necklace's turquoise stone shimmered like a piece of sky, hinting at a story I couldn't read yet. She stirred, lips moving. "It's too late now," she rasped, her voice raw and haunted. I pressed a damp cloth to her forehead, murmuring, "You're safe here." All night, we tended her. Caleb fetched water and changed compresses, steady as a man. Jesse kept the fire going, glancing at the window like he expected trouble. Her fever climbed with the moon, her murmurs spilling out Apache words. Talk of a deal, a betrayal. The captain, he took everything. Her voice, though weak, carried a refined sorrow that gnawed at me, tugging at my own buried pain. Dawn broke, and her fever eased. I sent the boys to bed, their faces drawn with worry. I stayed by her, watching her chest rise and fall, studying her delicate features. Who was she? What brought her, broken and alone, to my failing ranch? The questions churned as I kept watch. As sunlight crept through the window, her eyes opened deep, haunted, but alive. "You saved my life," she whispered, her voice rough but clear. I nodded, suddenly aware of the poverty in every corner of our cabin. "Rest now, questions can wait." She grabbed my hand, her grip firm. "Thank you," she said, her voice heavy with meaning, before slipping back into sleep. I watched her, a strange feeling stirring in me. Somehow, I knew our lives had changed forever. I sat by the fire in our cramped cabin, the weight of the day settling into my bones. The stranger Luna, I'd called her, was asleep on the cot, her breathing steadier now. Her whispered words, "It's too late now," echoed in my mind, stirring ghosts I'd tried to bury. I didn't know her story, but I felt it in my gut. She was running from something dark, something tied to the pain that had haunted me since Mary's death. I glanced at the silver ring and turquoise necklace on the table, their craftsmanship hinting at a past far grander than this harsh land. What had brought her here, broken and alone? Hey, if you're loving cowboy love stories or Western tales, drop a 1 in the comments for more Wild West love content. I couldn't shake the unease her presence brought. Every night since Mary's death, I'd sat here, cleaning my rifle, trying to keep the memories at bay. Caleb and Jesse were asleep, their small forms huddled under thin blankets. They'd been wary of Luna at first, but today, I'd caught them watching her, curious. She hadn't spoken much, but her eyes followed us with a sharpness that made me wonder what she saw. She'd helped with a sick horse earlier, her hands steady, calming the beast like she knew its soul. And yesterday, She'd warned me of a storm before I'd even smelled it in the air, saving my herd from ruin. Whoever she wasn't ordinary. As the fire crackled, Luna stirred, her fever breaking but her sleep restless. She muttered words I didn't understand, Apache, maybe, mixed with English. The captain, the deal. Her voice was raw, laced with fear. I leaned closer, catching fragments. Sold, betrayed, and my blood ran cold. Those words hit too close to the night Mary died, the night raiders tore through our ranch, leaving her blood on the dirt and my boys screaming. The sheriff had blamed the Apache, but I'd always known something was off. No tribe I'd ever met would have left that kind of carnage for no reason. I stood, pacing the small room, my eyes drawn to the necklace. Its turquoise stone glinted, pulling a memory I couldn't place. Then I looked at the ring. My heart stopped. The engraving inside it was Mary's, her wedding ring, the one she'd worn until that night. I'd thought it lost in the chaos, but here it was, in the hands of this stranger. My hands shook as I picked it up, the weight of it heavier than lead. How did Luna have it? Was she tied to the men who'd killed my wife? Caleb's voice broke my thoughts. He stood in the doorway, clutching the wooden horse Mary had carved him, his eyes sleepy but curious. "Pa, is she gonna be okay?" I forced a nod, guiding him back to bed. "She's tough, son. Go sleep." But as I tucked him in, Luna's voice came again, softer now. "Garrett, he took it." I froze. Garrett. The name burned in me. Captain Garrett, the cavalry officer who'd been stationed nearby when Mary died. I'd never trusted him, his slick words, his cold eyes. The sheriff had vouched for him, said he'd been hunting renegades that night, but I'd always wondered. I sat by Luna again, watching her face twist in sleep. She whimpered, her hands twitching like she was fighting something. Then, clear as day, she said, "The ring. It fell. I took it." My fists clenched. I wanted to shake her awake, demand answers. But I held back. She was still weak, and whatever she'd been through, it wasn't simple. I forced myself to breathe, to wait. Answers would come when she was ready. Over the next few days, Luna grew stronger. She still didn't talk much, but she moved with purpose, helping with small chores. She'd draw shapes in the dirt for Caleb and Jesse, teaching them to quiet their nightmares. They started to warm to her, especially Jesse, who'd linger by her side, watching her braid grass into tiny figures. I kept my distance, wrestling with the ring's weight in my pocket. I didn't tell the boys, it'd only scare them. But every time I looked at Luna, I saw Mary's ring, and the questions burned hotter. One afternoon, while the boys were at school, I found Luna by the corral, staring at the horizon. She held the turquoise necklace, her fingers tracing its edges. "Your wife," she said suddenly, her voice low, not looking at me. "She was kind?" I stiffened, caught off guard. "The kindest," I said, my voice rough. "She didn't deserve what happened." Luna nodded, her eyes distant. "No one does." That. I wanted to ask about the ring, but something in her face stopped me. Pain, deep as my own. Instead, I said, "That necklace, it's important to you." She clutched it tighter. "My mother's. All I have left." Her voice broke, and I saw the same shadows in her eyes that I carried. I understood then she'd lost someone too, maybe more than one. That night, after the boys were asleep, Luna sat across from me by the fire. She didn't speak at first, just drew patterns in the dirt floor with a stick. Then, slowly, she placed her hand on mine, her touch light but firm. She pointed to her chest, then mine, like she was linking our pain. With halting signs and a voice barely above a whisper, she started to tell her story. Her name was Kaylin, not Luna. She was Apache, daughter of a chief. Her father had given her to Captain Garrett, a white officer, as part of a peace deal. But Garrett was a monster, cruel, violent. She'd fled, taking the ring she'd found in the chaos of her escape. My heart pounded as she spoke. "The ring," I said, pulling it from my pocket. "It was my wife's." Kaylin's eyes widened, then filled with tears. "I found it after the attack. Garrett, he led them, not my people." Her words hit like a bullet. I'd known Garrett was rotten, but this? He'd killed Mary, blamed her death on the Apache to cover his tracks. I saw red, my hands shaking with rage. "Why'd you keep it?" I asked, my voice tight. Kaylin looked away. "It was a piece of her. I wanted to give it back, but I didn't know how." She paused, her voice breaking. "I'm sorry. I wanted to hate her, to blame her, but I couldn't. She was as much a victim as I was. Her pain mirrored mine, and in that moment, I saw her not as a stranger but as someone bound to me by shared loss." The next morning I sat with the ring in my hand, Mary's memory sharp as ever. Kaylin watched me from across the room, silent but steady. "He needs to pay," I said, more to myself than her. She nodded, her eyes fierce. "He will." For the first time in years, my grief wasn't just pain, it was purpose. I'd find justice for Mary, for my boys, for Kaylin. The ring wasn't just a relic now, it was proof. And Kaylin, this broken woman I'd saved, was the key to unraveling Garrett's lies. We didn't speak of it again that day, but something shifted between us. Her presence wasn't just a burden anymore, it was a spark, a reminder that I wasn't alone in my fight. As I watched her draw with Jesse later, her hands steady despite her scars, I felt a flicker of hope. Maybe, just maybe, we could heal each other's wounds. But first, Garrett would face the truth, and I'd make damn sure of it. I sat in the dim light of our cabin, the fire casting long shadows across the rough-hewn walls. Kaylin, she wasn't Luna anymore. Not after she'd bared her soul, sat across from me, her hands folded, eyes steady but carrying a weight I knew too well. The truth about Mary's death, about Captain Garrett, burned in my chest like a brand. Her words from last night, about the ring and Garrett's betrayal, had torn open wounds I'd thought long buried, but they'd also lit a fire in me, a purpose I hadn't felt since I'd held my boys through their first night without their mother. I'd get justice, not just for Mary, but for Kaylin, for Caleb and Jesse, for all of us broken by that man's cruelty. The morning was cold, the kind that seeps into your bones no matter how thick your coat. I was checking the fence line when Kaylin approached, her steps silent on the frosted ground. She didn't speak, just handed me a small bundle of sage tied with a strip of cloth. "For strength," she signed, her hands moving with the grace of someone who spoke more with gestures than words. I took it, nodding, though my mind was already in Dry Creek, where I'd faced Thumphan Elias Thorne. I'd known Elias for years. He was fair, but bound by the town's rigid ways. Convincing him Garrett was a murderer wouldn't be easy, but Kaylin's story and Mary's ring were proof I couldn't ignore. "Pa, you going to town?" Caleb asked, appearing at my side, his breath puffing in the chilly air. He clutched the wooden horse Mary had carved, his eyes sharp with that mix of boyish hope and too early wisdom. "Yeah, son," I said, ruffling his hair. "Got business with the judge." Jesse trailed behind, watching Kaylin with a shy smile. "Is she coming too?" I glanced at Kaylin, who nodded once, her jaw set. "She is." We rode into Dry Creek, Kaylin beside me, her silence louder than words. The town was quiet, folks casting curious glances at the Apache woman in tattered finery. I felt their stares, heavy with judgment, but I kept my head high. Vance men didn't slouch, and Kaylin carried herself like she was born to face down a storm. At the courthouse, Elias greeted us, his gray eyes narrowing as he took in Kaylin's bruised face and my grim expression. "Ethan, this better be worth my time," he said, leaning back in his chair. I laid Mary's ring on his desk, the silver glinting under the lamplight. "This was my wife's. Found it with her." I nodded at Kaylin. "She's got a story you need to hear." Elias raised an eyebrow, skeptical, but motioned for us to sit. Kaylin didn't speak at first. She drew in the dust on the floor simple lines forming a scene. A ranch, men on horseback, a woman falling. Her hands trembled, but her movements were precise, each stroke a piece of the truth. Then, in a voice rough as gravel, she spoke. "Garrett, he led them. Not my people, he killed her." I watched Elias's face harden as Kaylin recounted the attack, her words halting but clear. She described Garrett's men, the gunfire, the chaos. She mimicked the sound of a scream, Mary's scream, her voice cracking with the weight of it. My hands clenched, the memory of that night flooding back. Kaylin's eyes met mine, and I saw my own pain reflected there. She wasn't just a witness. She was reliving her own hell to give me justice. Elias leaned forward, his skepticism fading. "You're saying Captain Garrett, a decorated officer, led a raid on Ethan's ranch?" Kaylin nodded, pointing to the ring. "I found it after. He took it from her." She paused, her hands signing rapidly, then spoke again. "He sold me, to save my tribe, but he lied, used me." Her voice broke, but she held Elias's gaze, fierce and unbroken. I stepped in, my voice steady despite the rage boiling inside. "Garrett blamed the Apache to cover his tracks. He's been fleecing folks for years, Elias. You know the rumors." I pulled out a letter I'd gotten from Old Man Thompson at the store, who'd overheard Garrett threatening a rancher last spring. "This ain't just her word. Others'll talk if you listen." Elias rubbed his jaw, his eyes flicking between the ring and Kaylin's drawings. "That's a heavy accusation, Ethan. Garrett's got friends in high places." I leaned closer, my voice low. "And I've got 2 boys who lost their mother. She's got scars you can't see. We ain't lying." Kaylin reached out, her hand brushing mine, a silent anchor. Elias sighed, stacking his papers. "I'll open an investigation. Bring Garrett in for questioning. But you better have more than a ring and a story." We left the courthouse, the weight of the moment settling over us. Kaylin walked close, her shoulder brushing mine. "You believe me," she signed, her eyes searching. "I do," I said, and meant it. Her truth had cracked something open in me, not just anger, but a need to make things right. For her, for my boys, for Mary. Back at the ranch, I sat by Mary's grave, the ring in my hand. The wind carried the scent of sage, and I felt Kaylin's presence before I saw her. She knelt beside me, silent, her hand resting on my shoulder. I looked at her, the woman who'd carried my wife's ring through her own nightmare. "I blamed your people," I admitted, my voice rough. "For years I hated them." Kaylin's eyes softened, and she signed, "Pain blinds us, but truth heals." She took my hand, placing it over my heart. "Forgive yourself," she signed, her movements slow, deliberate. Tears burned my eyes. I'd carried the guilt of failing Mary like a stone in my chest, but Kaylin's words cut through it. Garrett was the monster, not me, not her people. I nodded, the weight lifting, just a fraction. "We'll get him," I said, my voice steady now. "For both of us." Over the next days, I worked the ranch with a new fire. I talked to other ranchers, men Garrett had bullied, gathering their stories like ammunition. Kaylin stayed close, her quiet strength steadying me. She'd draw with the boys, teaching them to face their fears, and I'd catch her watching me, a question in her eyes. Did I trust her? I did, more than I'd trusted anyone since Mary. She wasn't just a witness, she was part of this fight, part of us. The day of the hearing came fast. Dry Creek's courthouse was packed, folks whispering about the Apache woman and the widower taking on a cavalry captain. Garrett stood tall, his uniform crisp, his smirk sharp as a blade. But Kaylin didn't flinch. She stood before the judge, her voice stronger now, recounting every detail: her captivity, the raid, the ring. She mimicked Mary's scream again, the sound chilling the room. I saw folks shift, their doubt turning to anger. I added my piece, laying out the rancher's stories, the ring, the truth. Garrett tried to lie, but Kaylin's eyes pinned him, and her words cut through his bravado. Elias watched, his face grim, and when the gavel fell, Garrett was in chains. Justice wasn't full yet, there'd be a trial, but it was a start. Outside, Kaylin hugged Caleb and Jesse, who'd waited with bated breath. I stood back, the ring in my pocket no longer a weight but a promise kept. That night, by Mary's grave, Kaylin found me again. She didn't speak, just placed her hand on my shoulder. I looked at her, tears falling free. "Forgive," she signed again, and I nodded. For the first time, I felt it forgiveness, not just for her people, but for myself. Garrett's evil wasn't my fault, and I could let go of the guilt that had chained me. Kaylin's hand stayed on mine, and in her eyes I saw a future not just justice, but healing, for all of us. I stood in the quiet of our cabin, the fire low but warm, casting a soft glow over the room. The weight of Garrett's trial was behind us now, his chains a small victory in a long fight for justice. Kaylin sat across from me, her hands weaving a small braid of grass, her eyes no longer haunted but steady, like the prairie after a storm. She wasn't Luna anymore, she was Kaylin, a name that felt like a river running clear, carrying away the pain of her past. The boys, Caleb and Jesse, were asleep, their soft breaths a reminder of the life we were rebuilding. Kaylin's presence had changed us, not just by helping us bring Garrett down, but by bringing light back to this ranch, to my heart. I'd started to see her not as a stranger but as a partner in healing, someone who understood the scars we all carried. The morning after the trial, I found Kaylin outside, kneeling by the patch of earth where Mary's grave lay. She was planting something tiny green shoots I didn't recognize. "Lucky Clover," she signed, her hands moving with that quiet grace. "For her, for hope." I nodded, my throat tight. Mary would have liked that, would have seen the beauty in turning loss into something living. I helped her press the soil around the plants, our hands brushing in the dirt, and for the first time in years, I felt the ground beneath me, as more than a place of toil it was a home again. Kaylin had a gift, one I'd noticed more as she grew stronger. She could sense things, storms before they broke, sickness in the cattle before it showed, even the unspoken fears in my boys' hearts. That day, she walked the ranch with me, her fingers grazing the grass, her eyes scanning the horizon. "Water's close," she signed, pointing to a dry patch near the creek. I'd never thought to dig there, but her certainty was unshakable. We sank a well the next day, and sure enough, water bubbled up, clear and cold. The herd drank deep, and I saw Caleb's eyes widen, like he was seeing magic. "How'd she know, Pa?" he asked. I just shook my head, smiling. "She listens to the land, son." Dry Creek started to notice her too. Folks who'd whispered about the Apache woman began seeking her out. Old Man Thompson asked her to check his failing crops. She touched the soil and told him to plant rye instead of wheat. Come harvest, his yield was the best in years. Widow Jenkins brought her sick mare. Kaylin hummed softly, her hands calming the animal until it stood steady. Word spread, and soon folks were riding out to our ranch, not for me, but for her. She never turned them away. Though I saw the toll it took, her eyes would dim after long days, her hands trembling as she signed. I'd make her sit, brew her tea, and tell her to rest. She'd smile, that rare, quiet smile, and sign, "Helping heals me too." Caleb and Jesse took to her like she'd always been here. She taught them things I never could, how to read the wind, track a deer, weave grass into shapes that held stories. One afternoon I found her with Jesse, showing him how to draw a horse in the dirt. "Like your mother's," she signed, pointing to the wooden horse he clutched. Jesse's face lit up, and he hugged her, quick and fierce. Caleb, usually so guarded, started asking her about the stars, about Apache stories of the sky. She'd point out constellations, her hands painting tales of warriors and spirits. I'd watch from the porch, my heart full, seeing my boys smile in ways I thought they'd forgotten. Kaylin didn't just heal us, she changed the ranch. We rebuilt the barn together, her ideas making it stronger slanted roofs to shed snow, wider stalls for the horses. She suggested rotating the grazing fields, something I'd never tried, and the cattle grew fatter than they had in years. The wheat field, Mary's pride, bloomed again under her care. I'd catch her there sometimes, kneeling in the dirt, her hands buried in the soil, like she was speaking to it. "This land remembers her," she signed once, her eyes meeting mine. "It remembers you too." Oh. One evening, as the sun dipped low, painting the sky in golds and reds, Kaylin found me by the corral. I was whittling, something I hadn't done since Mary was alive. She sat beside me, her shoulder brushing mine, and handed me a small carving, a clover, delicate and perfect. "For you," she signed. I turned it over in my hands, the wood smooth under my fingers. "You're good at this," I said, my voice rough. She smiled, then signed, "You're good at this." She gestured to the ranch, the boys, the life we were building. My chest tightened. I didn't know how to say what I felt, that she'd brought me back from a place I thought I'd never leave. The town's harvest festival came, and for the first time since Mary's death, I wanted to go. Kaylin and the boys deserved it, a night of music, laughter, a chance to feel part of something bigger. We rode into Dry Creek, Caleb and Jesse chattering about the pie contest, Kaylin quiet, but her eyes bright. She wore a simple dress I'd bought her, the turquoise necklace glinting at her throat. Folks stared, but not like before. There was respect now, even warmth. Mrs. Thompson hugged her, thanking her for saving their crops. Widow Jenkins pressed a basket of apples into her hands. Kaylin signed her thanks, and I translated, my voice steady with pride. At the festival, Caleb won a ribbon for his whittling a horse, carved under Kaylin's guidance. Jesse danced with a girl from school, his shy grin lighting up the night. Kaylin stayed close, her hand brushing mine as we watched the boys. They're happy, she signed, her eyes soft. So are you. I looked at her, the firelight catching the strength in her face, the scars she carried with grace. Because of you, I said, the words slipping out before I could stop them. She didn't answer, just took my hand, her fingers warm and sure. That night, back at the ranch, I found her by Mary's grave, the clover patch now a green carpet under the moonlight. I sat beside her, the silence comfortable, like we'd known each other forever. I was afraid, I admitted, my voice low, afraid to let anyone in after Mary, afraid I'd fail again. Kaylin's hand found mine, her eyes steady. You didn't fail her, you saved me. Her signs were slow, deliberate. And them. She nodded toward the cabin where the boys slept. I swallowed hard, the truth settling in me. I'd loved Mary with everything I had, and her loss had nearly broken me. But Kaylin, she wasn't replacing Mary. She was something new, something I hadn't expected. I don't know how to do this, I said, my voice rough. To care again. She smiled, that rare smile that felt like a gift. We learned together, she signed, her hand resting over my heart. Like family. The word hit me hard, family. Not just me and the boys, but her too. I thought of Mary, of how she'd want Caleb and Jesse to have a home filled with love, not just survival. I thought of Kaylin's strength, her quiet way of mending what was broken. I love them, I said, nodding toward the cabin. And I'm starting to love you. The words felt raw, like pulling a splinter from deep in my chest. Kaylin's eyes glistened, and she signed, I love them too, and you. We sat there, hands clasped, the clover patch soft beneath us. It wasn't just about the ranch or the boys, it was about us. Two people who'd lost everything and found each other in the wreckage. I saw it then, a future, not just of justice, but of joy. Kaylin leaned against me, her warmth steadying me, and I knew we were building something real, something lasting. The next morning, we started calling the ranch Lucky Clover, a name the boys picked to honor the patch by Mary's grave. Kaylin taught them to tend it, showing them how to nurture the fragile shoots. She taught me too how to trust again, how to let love grow where pain had been. The ranch thrived, not just with crops and cattle, but with laughter, with stories, with us. Kaylin became more than a healer. She was a bridge, connecting Dry Creek's people, white and Apache, with her quiet wisdom. She'd sit with elders, signing stories of her people, and they'd listen, their eyes softening. One evening, as winter loomed, Kaylin and I stood on the porch, watching Caleb and Jesse chase fireflies. She handed me a small journal, its cover etched with a clover. For you, she signed, to write our story. I opened it, my fingers tracing the blank pages. Our story, I said, meeting her eyes. Not just mine. She nodded, her hand finding mine. Ours. And theirs. Inside, the boys called for us, their voices bright with plans for Christmas. Kaylin smiled, signing, Family. I pulled her close, feeling the weight of the past lift, replaced by the promise of what we'd build together. The ranch wasn't just a place anymore, it was a home, a testament to love reborn from loss, to scars that bloomed into something beautiful. Years have passed since that stormy night when Kaylin first stumbled into my life, broken and whispering, It's too late now. Now, as I stand on the porch of what we call Lucky Clover Ranch, the Montana wind carries a different song, one of hope, of healing, of a family forged from pain and love. Kaylin's beside me, her hand in mine, her turquoise necklace catching the last light of the day. Caleb and Jesse, now young men, work the corral, their laughter mingling with the lowing of the cattle. Our daughter Lily, just 5, chases fireflies, her giggles a melody that binds us all. This ranch, once a place of grief, is now a beacon of renewal, named for the clover patch that grows over Mary's grave, a symbol of how loss can bloom into something eternal. Hey, if you're loving cowboy love stories or Western tales, drop a 1 in the comments for more Wild West love content. The ranch has grown beyond what I ever dreamed. The fields are lush, the herds strong, thanks to Kaylin's wisdom. She's more than my wife. She's the heart of this place. Folks in Dry Creek call her the River Woman, not just for her name Kaylin, meaning a peaceful stream, but for her gift. She feels the land, knows where water hides, when crops will thrive, or when a horse is ailing. Last spring, when drought threatened the valley, she led a group of ranchers to a hidden spring, saving their herds. She doesn't speak much, still preferring signs and quiet gestures, but her presence speaks louder than words. Apache and white folks alike come to her now, seeking advice, and she bridges their worlds with a grace I've never seen. Caleb, at 16, is tall like I was, with Mary's steady eyes. He's a natural with the cattle, his hands sure as he ropes a stray. Kaylin taught him to listen to the land, to feel its rhythm, and he's taken to it like he was born for it. Jessie, 14, has her gentleness, always sketching in the dirt or whittling figures for Lily. They both carry Mary's memory, but Kaylin's given them something new, a way to turn their pain into strength. She taught them Apache stories, tales of stars and spirits, and they weave those into their lives, honoring both their mother and the woman who's become their second mother. Lily's our miracle, born under a harvest moon. Kaylin named her for the flowers that bloom wild on the prairie, and she's got her mother's fire. She follows Kaylin everywhere, mimicking her signs, learning to read the wind. I watch them together, my heart full, knowing Mary would have loved her. Kaylin and I never planned for a child, not after all we'd lost, but Lily's proof that love finds a way. She's the laughter in our home, the spark that keeps us moving forward. Dry Creek's changed too. The town used to whisper about Kaylin, the Apache woman, with haunted eyes. Now, they tell her story, our story, like a legend. How she faced Garrett in that courtroom, her voice steady as she tore through his lies. How she helped me forgive, not just him, but myself. How we built Lucky Clover from ashes. At the Harvest Festival, folks gather around her, asking her to bless their crops or calm their horses. She does it quietly, never seeking praise, but I see the respect in their eyes. She's mended more than this ranch, she's mended a community. One evening, as the sun sank low, Kaylin and I walked to the clover patch. Lily ran ahead, her small hands plucking blades of grass. Kaylin knelt, her fingers tracing the earth where Mary rests. "She's here," she signed, her eyes soft. "With us." I nodded, my throat tight. I don't feel Mary's loss the same way anymore. It's not a wound, but a memory that lives in the clover, in our children, in the life we've built. Kaylin's hand found mine, and she signed, "We made this. For them." Laugh. I thought back to the journal she'd given me years ago, now filled with our story pages of Caleb's first cattle drive, Jesse's carvings, Lily's birth, Kaylin's quiet strength. I wrote about the day we named the ranch, how the boys chose Lucky Clover to honor Mary and Kaylin's hope. I wrote about the nights we sat together, her teaching me signs, me teaching her to trust again. Our love didn't erase the past, it grew from it, like clover from barren soil. The town's children know our story too. They come to the ranch, wide-eyed, asking Kaylin to tell them about the whisper of the sands, the way she hears the land's secrets. She smiles, signing tales of her people, of spirits in the wind, while I translate. Caleb and Jesse join in, adding their own stories, and Lily chimes in with her chatter. It's a legacy, not just of us, but of Dry Creek, a place where pain becomes strength, where love crosses divides. As winter nears, we're planning a gathering, Apache and white families together, to share food and stories. Kaylin's idea, of course. She signs, "Healing is sharing." I see it in the way she's taught our children, the way she's taught me. We're not just a family. We're a promise kept to Mary, to Kaylin's mother, to the land itself. Lucky Clover Ranch stands as proof that scars don't end a story, they start one. Tonight, as I write this, Kaylin's beside me, her head resting on my shoulder. Lily's asleep, clutching a grass figure Jesse made. Caleb and Jesse are outside, checking the herd under the stars. The wind whispers through the clover, carrying the story of our lives, a tale of loss, love, and redemption. It's the whisper of the sands, Kaylin calls it, and it's ours, forever.